So, good morning. Is everyone in the room? It looks so. Yeah, it also looks that you haven't had your morning coffee yet. But I hope that the session we gathered this morning will get you up very, very soon. So welcome again, the second day of the TEPE 2015 conference. Pavel Zgaga is my name, and I'm chairing this session with assistance of Jakob Saye from the staff. Welcome. We are a nice group of how many? 13 people right now, and we are still waiting the 14th at least, the third speaker of today, who will, I'm quite sure, certainly come. So we have three presentations in this session. Reading, if you read abstracts, then you can easily see that these are, in certain way, broader perspectives on the topic of this year conference, and they have, I would say, a fil rouge. All three presentations put the problems of education, teacher education today, into a timely perspective. Mateja will start, if I understood well, with the last 200 years. Anders will continue with maybe last 5,000 years. I'm joking a little bit, but you will allow me that. And Maria, who will come, I hope, with a little delay, she will address the same issues within last 15 years perspective. So perspectives are different, but the problem is the same. The issues, the troubles with education today are not characteristic only for today. They have a long barb, as we say. So, as you perhaps also noted, we record this session, and I hope you agree with that. This will give a chance to colleagues who are not able to be with us today to listen later. And we already agreed in pre-session with the speakers that presentations will be given one by one, followed by a general discussion. Of course, you have at least two options how to address now these to attendees in this session, to participants. You have at least two chances, two options how to come in with questions and comments. You can either put them into chat, and I will check it from time to time. And the other option is, of course, that you raise your hand at the end of presentation, and you will get, you unmute yourself at that time, and you will be able to ask and comment. Is this okay with everyone? If it is, then we will not lose our scarce time, and I invite Mateja to start her presentation.
Thank you. I must say in advance that I have tooth surgery a month ago, and the dentist damaged my nerve in mouth, and that's why I have some problem with articulation. I will try to speak as clear as possible. So, and I will read my presentation for about 20 minutes. Yes, I check. So I will talk about crisis of education as a name for lowering the educational standards. And this has a long history with Adorno. Yeah. The common starting point and general consensus is that the crisis of education is part of broader social processes and therefore cannot be solved by pedagogy itself. Adorno begins his text, Theory of Half Education, with these findings. The crisis of education cannot be a mere subject of the teaching profession, because it is a broader process of diminution of intellectual difficulty towards those who are to be educated, and the powerful influence of extra-pedagogical reality. So the problem is to try to grasp the strength of what is happening. Although the voices that focus the attention of pedagogy on itself appeared very early, the pedagogy is slowly acknowledging the problem, but it is not recognized in it. It searches the reasons for lowering the level of education outside the school, in a broader social context in relation to which it is powerless, because it transcends and supersedes it. But a lowering of educational standards is also a direct consequence of the schoolwork. In this respect, pedagogy responds with an objection that's addressed already Adorno. Almost 70 years after Adorno's text and more than 10 years after Liessmann's work, the situation has not changed significantly. Notwithstanding the equality of conditions and the untenability of processes, which cannot longer be denied even by pedagogy itself, pedagogy defends itself against such criticism by establishing criteria for consideration. Processes that lead unrestrictedly and uncontrollably to a lower level of knowledge can only be discussed if certain conditions have been met in advance. Before anything can be constructed, empirical research must be carried out, which may well lead to the opposite. Adorno already draws attention to this possibility. For Adorno, however, theoretical considerations are not compatible with research results, for without speculative transgression of boundaries, without the inevitable moment of untruth in theory, theory would not be possible at all. Empirical research cannot be a criterion for what can and cannot be considered. Any empirical research that, in accordance with scientific criteria, correctly uses verification methods must always carry out an interpretation work. In doing so, it does not normally question the general ideological background. It poses problems in its context and with its concepts, which cannot be called into question when it is applied in concrete terms. Adorno's theory of half education was not intended to subsume all classes and all people under this term, but only to construct a tendency to sketch the physiognomy of certain spirit, which would determine the sign of its time, even if the range of its validity had to be considerably restricted. The second demand that pedagogy a priori addresses to its critiques is constructiveness. It expects concrete guidance from the theoretical consideration. If the theory claims that it understood the problem in theory, then it should solve it in practice too. At this point, we do not want to deny the influence of social reality on the school, or even on the entire educational system. But we also do not want to lose sight of the autonomy of its activities. We will be interested in what happened to the knowledge and ability to think with the modern school, and how the pedagogy itself is involved in creating the condition of its own failure. The lowering of educational standards as direct results of modern pedagogical practices is addressed by Liessmann, who does so with a lot of irony, as well as Furedi, and thus also raises the question of pedagogy, not only the analysis of the pervasive present, that powerful force in relation to which pedagogy is powerless. However, since pedagogy is a field characterized by the primacy of practice over theory, it is considered that the presence or absence of certain practices within the school should be determined by concrete results that they are capable of producing. This also means that they can be judged on the basis of the results they produce. The consequences of modern pedagogical approaches embodied in didactic knowledge as norms that define the ways of school from within are a general lowering of the level of knowledge and its transformation into competence, leading to confidential inexperience, as Liesman symbolically expressed itself, actually referring to the self-consciousness of someone who does not know that he does not know. The lowering of educational standard is thus also a criterion for measuring modern school practices. The criterion of modern pedagogical didactic approaches is hardly anything else than the knowledge in which they result. Now I will speak about past. Building up the educational system is not a feature of capitalism as such, but rather a question of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So its identity determines the struggle that the bourgeoisie had to fight in battle with the church as the central institution of the feudal order. In the struggle against religion, the ideological dominance of feudalism, the bourgeoisie relied on its other, knowledge, on which it built the educational system. Knowledge, in this sense, was the mobilization of the bourgeoisie. Dare to know was its motto. Sapere aude is basically an idea of how to create the conditions for a lasting gradual advance that could avoid the violence of the revolution. From this point of view, it is significant that today, when it is finally becoming clear that we are deep inside capitalism, education is losing its meaning. This raises the question of what are the causes of the transformation of developed capitalist societies, which are moving towards a lowering of educational standard. Is it possible that the educational system is so easily left to such transformation simply because it has lost its ideological function? In this respect, the experience of our territory and of the former socialist bloc states, which are not since always, since ever in capitalism, can be valuable. In the transition from socialism to capitalism, the story of building a new ideology had to repeat in a certain way. But at this time, the subversive mobilization did not have knowledge, but individual identity, so deeply subjected to the ideological bonds of real socialism. We have survived the transition, and so today we live in a time of mass individualism characterized by an individual with a weak attitude towards collective and strong attitude towards his own individuality. The ruling ideology commands us to surrender to the endless experiential possibilities of life, which capitalism will graciously take care of, and we realize our own individuality in it. It is in this all-encompassing ideological context that school must operate today. Since education has always been directed towards the individual and the development of its potentials, transition which has to offer something else than knowledge for its success had made it so much easier to leave its stamp on the educational system. In accordance with the dominant ideology, the modern school is characterized by an increasing affirmation of individuality as such, which simply submits education to the imperative of developing individual identity. The school as institution of knowledge and its constitutive principle is the transfer of knowledge. As a particular institution, it is independent space with its own logic and its own rules. The traditional educational system, which has persisted with minor corrections since the establishment of the school system, is characterized by a three-stage logic derived from three stages of learning. Humboldt, who actively participated in the formation of the educational system that we still have today, claims in the Königsberg curriculum that in the philosophical view, there are only three stages of education: elementary education, school education, and university education, corresponding to the modern division into primary, secondary, and tertiary education. The function of each level is formulated in development logic and also called natural stages. And since there are only these three stages of learning, there are also three types of institutions that follow each others. The task of elementary education, which would correspond to what is today the beginning of primary school, is to establish a state of acceptance and expression of thought, and to overcome the problems presented by design in all its main types. For Humboldt, the elementary education is not yet about instruction in the full sense of the word, but about preparing for the instruction that makes true instruction possible. The purpose of the next level, school education, which would correspond to today's end of primary school and high school, is to acquire knowledge and develop the skills needed to understand science. Both knowledge and skills pupil must acquire through learning. So he is busy in two ways: once by learning itself, and secondly by learning to learn. In this way, a famous formulation, learn to learn, has come into being, which over the years has become completely detached from its specific context. Humboldt is certainly not the author of the modern motto, learn to learn, which is only the rest of his sentence in changed ideological condition. A pupil achieves the goals of school education when he is able to learn on his own and thus become mature for university education. I quote, "The pupil is mature when he has learned so much from others that he is now able to learn on his own." For Humboldt, school instruction is only possible with the help of a teacher. So the goal of school instruction is reached when the pupil can do without a teacher, when the teacher becomes superfluous. One may say that pedagogy is an impossible profession for Humboldt as well. Impossible because it must lead and strive for its own disappearance. At university level, third and after Humboldt, the last natural stage of the development of faculty of learning, which as achieved means emancipation from proper instruction and represents the limit of teaching itself, the nature of the teacher's work as well as the nature of the pupil's work necessarily change. The pupil becomes a student who is studying. Therefore, the university teacher is no longer a teacher and the student no longer a learner, but explores himself, and the teacher only conducts and supports his research. For Humboldt, the university is a place of unity, of teaching and research, because learning at this stage cannot be separated from research. Such learning does not have a natural end at the previous two stages. For that reason, it is not possible to determine a certain sign of his maturity as a student. It can only achieve its purpose in lifelong learning. The organizational ideas of the creators of the educational system, in which education is still taking place today, started from the human capacity for learning, which carries out development from elementary to university education, from the stage of creating basic conditions for learning through content instruction and learn to learn, to independent learning as a research in which learning is only fully realized. Of course, those times are long gone. We were interested in what education meant at the time of establishing the educational system, which is also the time when belief in the power of education was at its greatest. The answer to the question posed by Furedi, why school no longer educates, must be sought both outside the school, in the ruling ideology of modernity, which offers authentic realization beyond knowledge, but also in the educational institutions themselves, in the forms of knowledge production within them, the resources of didactic emancipation, which were probably right at some point in the development of educational institutions, are slowly being exhausted. But despite the results they produce, they persist. Nowadays, no one participates in snowball, brainstorming, poster drawing, role-playing, workshop, etc. to learn, because it would almost be a miracle, and we know that. And that's why one cannot take school seriously. Modern pedagogy practices directly coincide with the dominant ideology that locks the subject into the possibility of the authentic realization, which is why we can meet them almost everywhere, not only in school. Adorno concludes his text, Theory of Half Education, with the appeal that it is time for anachronism to insist on the idea of education. For 50 years later, Liesman finds that education does not grab almost no one. Does this mean that the Enlightenment project is no longer understood, or it is superfluous? So finally, we return to the basic question: why did the Enlightenment set knowledge as the basis of autonomy? What is the emancipatory potential of knowledge? Simply that there is no knowledge without thinking. Knowledge is the result of thinking, and it can be dissolved in it again at any time. He who would appropriate the knowledge must think for himself. The emancipatory potential of the school lies in knowledge, which rises because knowledge directly forms the subject through the thinking required to appropriate it. One who knows does not need anyone else, can rely exclusively on himself. He can be autonomous. The Enlightenment school was a bourgeois weapon in the struggle against religion. It tried to teach the young to think there where it was impossible to survive without thinking. The basic source of the Enlightenment emancipation potential of knowledge is its objectivity and subjective attitude it implies. A knowing subject, and this can become anyone endowed with the light of reason, can only be established by a universally valid argument. Therefore, the subject who can in knowledge depend only on itself, and therefore be autonomous, has to think universally valid thought, such an uncreative fact for a modern school, but an undeniable emancipatory starting point for the Enlightenment. A test of validity of a given thought is also suspension of its subjectivity. This is basically the Enlightenment idea of school and education for all. School is a place designed to form a subject through knowledge, which is verified in each repetition with its thinking. Certainly nothing more foreign to a modern pedagogical banners. So.
Thank you very much, Mateja.
Yes.
This is the first of our 3 presentations. In the meantime, our room became a little bit tense. We are now 24 and we started only 12. So that's great. We have a great auditorium and a lack of time. So my proposal would be that we continue straight on. Just to repeat once again what I said at the beginning when our virtual lecture room was not yet full. You can comment or question either in chat room or later on orally by raising hand. We will listen to all 3 presentations first, and then the last half an hour, we will ask questions and comment what the presenters said. Okay, so now I invite Anders Norberg from Sweden to unmute and take the floor.
Thank you, Pavel. I'll try to share my presentation here. Yes, and yeah. Do you see my presentation here now?
Yes, it's very well.
Thank you. Well, I'm an old philosophy teacher, but I've been working with education development and the development of access to education for my hometown, the municipality of Skellefteå in northern Sweden, that does not have a university or university college of its own, but a multi-institutional campus that's kind of an extra large learning center or something like that. And that's my perspective, and critical perspective, and a perspective to try to find new and other perspectives and openings to access to education and so on. And here in my presentation, I'm not talking about education of children, but education of adults, such as teacher education, for example. But some of this is very applicable on all education and so on. And my co-author is Nick Bowskill from University of Derby. He will be presenting another time-based presentation at 1 o'clock and so. But let's go, teachers and ICTs, time and time again. I want to start in this with that many expressions that we use and see no problems with are a really very problematic expression, and this is a very good example. Distance learning. Well, people learn where they are. If they learn, they don't learn anywhere else. It's their local conditions that are their environment. But this term reflects a kind of center-periphery dimension, and what really should be here is distance teaching. That's a perfectly meaningful term, and very much that is written about distance learning, online learning, e-learning, etc. is really about the organization of teaching, and I cannot really understand why we jump over this stage, and this only illustrates that this ICT and learning hype that we are living in and negotiating and discussing, we may have been too fast to decide what this is about and how this works. And I will try to make some thought-provoking things here. First, I really like this citation from Oliver and Trigwell in a classic paper, that the word learning should rightfully be returned to the learner. so on. And one reference here I recommend is Gerrit Gesta about the learnification of education, that universities nowadays want to sell learning directly when what they do is really teaching, hoping for learning, etc. This is an important distinction I will use. Well, then I want to pose the question, is ICT enabled distance learning, e-learning, online learning, blended learning? What is it really about? Which perspective are we using? Is place of perspective a kind of broadcasting out model? Is that what we're talking about? Is technology the perspective, a kind of work distribution between teachers and technology? Or is time a reasonable perspective, which I think and is going to try to illustrate how. Well, I will come back to this time and time again, as well as I use the Professor Luciano Floridis' philosophy of information. There are two meanings of ICTs in education, really. Well, it's about information friction decrease, that we can send information, share information, create information very easily, etc. And that's an old development that really began with writing and then print and things like that. But ICT in education in other well, ICT in society now is a lot about information processing, but in education we haven't really come much to this stage and so on. But I will discuss this place and technology for ending up in time and then ending up in some future questions. You've all heard utterings like this, that education is broken and Silicon Valley is going to fix it. A kind of idea that everything, all this bad or everything new is fantastic and revolutionary, etc. And I want to question how we look at this. Do we look at this, at ICTs in education, as a sudden disruption and education revolution where campuses will disappear or so? Or do we look at it as a kind of trial and error and negotiation and step-by-step adoption process, etc.? We should remember that both writing in itself thousands of years ago and also prints were once high-tech and very conflict-filled ICTs. We don't think of them as a technology any longer because we've used them so much and they are being implemented in everything that we do. I just have a nice quote here. Lectures were once useful, but now when all can read and books are so numerous, lectures are unnecessary. This is from England in the 17th century, and we know that it really did not end up like that. and so on. I'll go on here and discuss place. Well, in all these expressions and many more, this with ICTs and education is seen from some kind of place perspective. Distance learning, decentralized education, that's not in the right place, so to say. Education distribution, that we distribute these goods over larger areas, etc. And remote students and remote teachers, and in some case campus education can have both remote students and remote teachers, but the internet fibers perhaps goes through the university campus, etc. And mobile learning, of course, learning has always been mobile with the learner, but this is another meaning. Here, the perspective is from the classroom and out into the unknown. It's a kind of broadcasting model that often says that the longer the distance, the more technology is needed, and the more unknown and unclear are the results. So I see it as a center periphery perspective, or perhaps a place power perspective, etc. I really like this Swedish painting from the 1970s of the classroom. It's called "Are You Becoming Profitable, Little Friend?" And it's a classroom in the context of industrialization of the society and so on. And I remember this kind of classroom and feel a lot at home. But I hear a lot of expressions about the online classroom, and that the thing is really to replicate the classroom online, etc. And I really doubt that it's exactly that we should do, and so on. Yeah, this is my historical reference here. I've been looking at something into the invention of writing on tablets in old Sumer and so on, about 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. And to the left, you see an excavated school or a classroom here, which was seen as a very high-tech institution, the tablet house, where you learned to write. I guess it was even more hype than our computer labs today, etc., because it was new, it was technology. You could conserve oral things in print, etc. But the scribes of these times thought it was very problematic to have a lot of apprenticeships. It obstructed them in work and so on, and that was not good. So somebody seems to come up with the idea, why don't we take one scribe that really knows this art and a lot of interested people that does not know, and we close them into a building, and we don't let them out before they all know, or before we can sort who knows and do not know, etc. I use this for saying that the classroom is a kind of ICT itself. The classroom walls isolates teachers and students from the information flows of the outside world, and helps the teacher to take his teaching in a special order, and it regulates information and so on. But today the classroom really doesn't have this isolating function. Information goes in all ways, really, all the time, etc. So a classroom has changed as well, but it is an information and communication technology, an old one, and so on. And just want to say something about the word presence. You know, are the students present in the classroom, etc. My favorite philosopher, Luciano Floridi, he says that many of our basic terms are sliding in its meaning. We know this with presence as a kind of physical body count in a room, but we also have for long talked about presence as being active and interactable, etc. Are you really following this teaching? Are you present? Hello, hello. I want attention, the teacher is saying. And it's only to question oneself as a teacher. Would you prefer a student on the last room in the classroom doing his Instagram or Facebook, or an interested student in a faraway place following and interacting with your teaching, etc.? This is the both meanings of presence, and we perhaps more and more should concentrate on a presence in the meaning B, as presence as being interactable and following things, etc., more than being present in a room. So I think I propose that we agree on this, that students are always learning here and now, but their possibilities to communication and to access information can vary, and that's about course design and so on. So perhaps we should choose another track than this place perspective, and then we have this technology perspective. Well, how is technology to replace teachers, or to enable teachers, or to augment teachers to do a better job? And this is a sensitive questions about work distribution. You all have heard this, that any teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be replaced by a computer, etc. But that is still a problematic. And you see this nice French postcard, 100 years old, up to the right here, where the teacher is grinding down the books, and it goes directly into the student's head, or perhaps it's a podcast, I don't really know, but it's a vision about education in the year 2000. And all this can be very frightening. We don't want schools to look like car factories. Do you see the human working in here? He's there. So, but well, this is a metaphor. The work division between teachers and technology must look very different in some way. But when teachers, I say that I don't want to use a technology because I don't need to. All the students are here, etc. Teachers has always used a technology, and what we call technology is only new technology that we still are not used to and still don't master. Then it ceases to be technology. Well, time is a very mystical thing. I jump over that slide, and well, we have different meanings of times: scheduled time, industrial time, which is also university time and school times with schedules and rooms and resources, etc. But for students, time is often subjective and relative. All have their own time, dependent on their movements, etc. So we have a kind of conflict between teaching time conception and learning time conception, really. And here is only one thing to think of. When we think of a course from start to end, we often think of scheduled meetings and labs and the tests in the end, etc. But when we discuss this more, we see this that these are only the synchronous meetings. We demand a lot of asynchronous and flexible work from the student as well. Assignments, readings, taking part in forum discussions, which is more flexible and already really distance education, could we say, and so on. These are also a part of the course, and we have always wanted the synchronous and the asynchronous parts to be connected to one another and not constitute two different courses, which sometimes happens, or a so-called course and a half. similar. And this is a very old pattern. It's really about you have homework until Friday, and we will check up if you have understood then and introduce the new thing and go on. We don't need digital ICTs for doing this, and in my view, this kind of blended learning teachers have been doing for as long as there has been any learning media and so on. But what's changed?
Excuse me,
yes.
1 minute left.
Yes. Okay. What has changed then? Yes, asynchronous work can be supported and organized a lot better today on LMSs, etc. More teaching can be organized asynchronously online. We easily move activities from the synchronous to the asynchronous by recording them, and move them also in the other way as in the flipped classroom concepts. And we replace some physical meetings with Zoom meetings, etc. And we can easier connect synchronous and asynchronous things, etc. But this is a use of information decreasing ICTs that we know, but other kind of ICTs that's coming in is adaptive learning ICTs that uses learning analytics for adapting both the time and the challenges to the individual student, etc. And this is a way of making learning constant and time variable instead of the opposite, and so on. But well, I jump away here. I was a little too optimistic here, but my presentation will be available. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders, very much for your presentation. We are now somewhere in the middle of our time, and I immediately invite Maria to take the floor and to continue with her presentation. And I ask Anders to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Maria.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I'm trying to share my screen. Let me see. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because it takes a while. Let me see. Okay. So good morning, everybody. I will be presenting some thoughts and ideas arising from research, but also from my own experience as a teacher educator about the teacher education programs after the implementation of the Bologna process. So the title of my paper is Teacher Education in the Post-Bologna Context, Challenges and Future Directions. As we know, teacher education is key to the development of societies and to the quality of education. Actually, quality is a catchword, and as we know, high quality teachers matter, and therefore their education must be taken seriously. As I said, the teacher education has been seen as a key element in driving change in education, but it is also true that it is possible to identify concerns about its quality and effectiveness in preparing high quality teachers along with the different understandings of what quality means. So if the word quality is reiterated in different kinds of policy documents and in other documents and in research, quality means different, has different meanings when it comes to understand its scope in different contexts. In order to understand, fully understand the teacher education, it is important to consider the political, the culture, the economic, the social context in which teacher education is embedded. And in this paper, I will particularly focus on teacher education after the implementation of the Bologna process in Portugal. So I'm talking about 2007 onwards. But in order to understand also the teacher education, I think it's important to see how, what are the main characteristics of the teaching profession. Because it also relates to issues related to teacher recruitment and of course teacher education. So what are the main characteristics of the teaching profession in Portugal? First of all, according to the national official data, the National Council for Education, the teaching profession is seen as a feminized profession. Around 79% are female teachers. It's a profession marked by the aging of the teaching workforce. So as you can see, most of the teachers are 50 or above 50 years old. Also because they are experienced teachers, they also have an average of professional grade of 14 points out of 20, which is the professional grade for teachers to access a given teaching post. It's a high profession. They also hold a high professional experience in terms of years of service. But it is also possible to identify a decrease in the attractiveness of the teaching profession. This is not only true for the Portuguese context, it's for other contexts, but this is something that needs to be highlighted when talking about the teaching profession in Portugal. And as you can see, by 2030, more than half of the teachers will have retired. So this is a critical situation, because within the next decade, it will be, there is a need to replace many teachers. Also, the last TALIS report highlights a dramatic change in this regard, because there has been a significant increase of teachers aged 50 or above in Portugal, from 28% in TALIS 2013 to 47% in TALIS 2018. And the average of the OECD countries is 44 years old, whereas in Portugal is 47. So overall, when we talk about the teaching profession in Portugal, we talk about the lack of valorization of the teaching profession. And this is another report from the National Education Council in Portugal. The professional fatigue and burnout, precarious working conditions at the beginning of the career especially, and the lack of career prospects. Also, if we look at the research available, it's possible to see also this negative picture of the teaching profession from the part of the teachers themselves. The lowering of the economic and social status, this is a common theme in teachers' accounts, but also in other official and research reports. So the lowering of the economic and social status, the lack of career prospects, an increase of the workload and bureaucracy, an accentuation of criticism and of teachers, greater control over their work, and also a negative image of teaching and teachers in the media. And in this regard, teachers agree or state that the negative image of the teaching in the media has contributed to the deterioration of the teaching profession. So what about teacher education in the after the implementation of the Bologna process? It's interesting to note that in Portugal, in order to become a teacher, a master degree is required for all levels of teaching. So from preschool to secondary school. So we are talking about a high professional qualification for teachers at the second cycle level, according to the structure of the degrees in European context. So a master degree, because we are talking about a master degree, it has been agreed, tacitly agreed, that it is a research-based degree. So it includes a research dimension. And another key feature relates to the importance of practicum, the observation and collaboration in teaching situations under the supervision of a mentor and supervisor. And of course, within these school-university partnerships, and also the quality assurance that needs to be also highlighted in terms of teacher qualification and initial teacher education programs. So these are the key features of the process of change of all teacher education programs in Portugal after the implementation of the Bologna process. If you look at this table, I don't have enough time to explain, but before Bologna, we used to have an integrated model of training. It was a 5-year degree, a licenciatura. So it was integrated because student teachers would have to learn, or the program includes from the very beginning subjects related to the content knowledge, but also educational sciences or pedagogy from the very beginning. It was 5-year degree, including 1 year of practicum, the 5th year of the program. And as I said, the educational science and subject matter were included from the very beginning of the course. That's why the integrated designation. So also it includes theory and practice. After the implementation of the Bologna process, of course, we have a new framework, and the option the option was to choose a sequential model, so a consecutive model, a 3+2. So we are talking about a 2-year master degree in teaching, which of course includes the separation between a 2-year master's degree in teaching, a second cycle, plus a first cycle in a given subject. In terms of the practicum, as you can see, even if there is a valorization of the teaching of the practice, the professional practice, student teachers spend less time in schools. So this is a paradox in this new model. Overall, in terms of characteristics, we can say that there is a fragmentation between subject matter and educational sciences, because we are talking about a 3+2 step model for teacher education. And another interesting feature is that there is a valorization of the research component and the professional practice, as I said before. So these are the 5 compulsory curriculum components of teacher education in Portugal, training for the master degree. So I'm talking only about the master degree. Training in subject matter, general educational training, which includes curriculum and assessment, school and as an organization, psychology, and etc. The specific didactics for a given teaching level of teaching and subject matter, the cultural, social, and ethical education, and professional practices. So these are the 5 compulsory elements of the curriculum of initial teacher education at the moment. So what are the lessons learned and the remaining challenges in this model, consecutive model, that I very briefly presented? First of all, it is important to understand that the Bologna process, as in other contexts, was an external imposition, changing all programs, both in its structure and in its content. And it was a fast, quick process, which entailed, of course, different kinds of discussions and debates about what would be the best structure for teacher education, but also in terms of the content and the profile of the teachers to be educated. So this reconfiguration of initial teacher education entailed new and old challenges related not only to the timing and process of change itself. As I said, it was a very quick process, but also in its structure. And the adoption of a consecutive model was, I mean, it's not, there are different understandings or different views in relation to the adoption of a consecutive model, because especially because of what we used to have within this integrated model of teacher education. So in a way, there was a drawback in this regard. So it is possible also to identify some issues that are reiterated in other contexts, namely the link between theory and practice, because now we can see that there is a separation between the first degree and the second degree, the master degree in teaching. Also the fragmentation of the curriculum components and the place of the practicum and the role of research. So there are some issues that can be raised. I think one of the most important ones relate to the teacher identity. So is it possible to develop this professional teacher identity within a 2-year degree, a more condensed program? What about the professional knowledge? Especially if we look at the integration between the subject knowledge and the pedagogical dimension and professional practice dimension. So one lesson learned relates to the adoption of a research stance, which can be said as positive, but it's also controversial. So is it possible to include the research dimension in teacher education within this master degree of teaching? We can see that this inquiry-based approach is clearly a positive component, a positive element in this in current teacher education programs, and it is in a way innovative, an innovative feature of the new model if we compare it to the previous model. And this program was implemented for the first time in 2007-2008. The aim is to promote a critical understanding and intervention in pedagogical contexts, as well as the development of a research culture. So the idea is that student teachers need to be research literate. So teacher education needs to include these components. I don't have enough time to explain, but for instance, in my university, the profile, what we call the professional profile of the teacher to be, includes, especially in practicum, includes 3 dimensions: a conceptual dimension, strategic dimension, and axiological dimension. So the first one relates to the theoretical framework of professional practice, so the knowledge that student teachers need to develop and to mobilize in their practicum particularly. The strategic dimension relates to the methodological framework, so it, for instance, processes and techniques of analysis and development of subject knowledge and teaching in order to develop their pedagogical interventions in the contexts in which they do their practicum. And finally, the axiological dimension, which is linked to values of professional practice and of course to the ethical and political values that underpin their action as teachers or student teachers. One issue related to the research is that the questioning of its feasibility in teacher education. Now, is it possible within this condensed model of teacher education to develop this research dimension. And another aspect relates to the existence of different conceptions of the research. So it is possible to see, for instance, if we look at the practicum reports, to find different kinds of orientations or conceptions of research, for a more positivist stance to action research. And even it is possible to identify different kinds of conceptual framework or orientations from the part of the supervisors. As we know, inquiry demands time, and the condensed 2-year master degree represented paradoxically the valorization of professional practice, but at the same time, less time spent in schools. So this is a paradox within this new model. So is it possible, does it make sense to include the research stance in this kind of context? The second lesson learned relates to this idea that an inquiry-based model, which is one positive feature, entails also more expensive and sophisticated roles for teacher educators and mentors. So it is important for them to become familiar with the philosophy of the teacher education model in the post-Bologna context. It's important to discuss the relevant professional learning experiences that need to be provided for student teachers in terms of coursework and fieldwork. And as I said, the need for supervisors and cooperating teachers to reshape their traditional roles and to become partners of pedagogical inquiry and renewal. So it is important for both of them to clearly discuss and integrate and analyze and become familiar, like I said, with this research approach, which is not an easy task. Because developing this inquiry-based approach to teacher education requires that cooperating teachers and university supervisors to position themselves in an inquired stance to better understand and to investigate their own practice. So there have been some strategies in this regard. For instance, it is possible for cooperating teachers or mentors to do a training course, a training program at the beginning of each school year on the inquiry-based model, so that they become familiar what is what is required from the part of student teachers. So this is also something that needs to be highlighted in this kind of new framework of teacher education after the implementation of the Bologna process. The lesson learned number 3.
Maria, 1 minute left.
Okay. So I will quickly summarize that another key feature relates to the collaborative dimension of professional learning, because student teachers develop an individual pedagogical project. And I think this is something that needs to be enhanced. I will skip the lesson number 5 and 6, and I sum up. So there are some positive and innovative features, particularly this inquiry-based approach, but of course there is room for improvement, namely the collaborative dimension, the mentoring, scholarship of teacher education, ethical and social and cultural dimensions that I think need to be fostered in teacher education in Portugal. And this is the last slide. So what I would like to say is that maybe it's important to rethink the policy and the politics of teacher education, especially if you take into consideration the critical situation of teacher education in Portugal at the moment, namely the aging of the teaching workforce and the decrease in the number of teacher candidates. The second one is the relevance and the potential of quality initial teacher education in face of threats, namely, for instance, Teach for Portugal. So how can we recruit the best teachers, and how can we guarantee that they receive the best education in order to face the complexity of teaching. And I would say that not investing in teacher education in such challenging times would represent a drawback on the qualification of Portuguese teachers and a possible loss or maybe lack of valorization of relevant knowledge and experience in initial teacher education, which has been accumulated over the last decades. If we look at the scientific publications and research done in Portugal in relation to initial teacher education, there is a great deal of evolution, I mean, important evolution, important publications, and it would represent a drawback if, and even a deprofessionalization of teachers if alternative routes would become also an alternative for teacher education in Portugal. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. It's a very interesting national case study, if I may say so. While listening to you, I would say this is not only Portugal. Quite some parts of your presentation could be also signed by my country, Slovenia, or by some other countries around us and presented here in this virtual room as well. Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you. Thanks to all three speakers once again. We are now in the last part of our session, the discussion part. Again, you can ask questions in the chat or by raising your hand. But before starting with questions and answers, all three speakers, if you wish, you can send your slides or your paper to the conference email, and they will be posted on the website so that also other participants from this conference who are not able to join can read, can get the main message from you. Thank you. So now I just look to chat. I think we could have some, just a second. I would invite Ylva Lindberg. She posted the first question at 9:28, as I see, to the first speaker. Ylva, are you here? I'm not sure because there have been changes in the room, but nevertheless, Ylva asked Mateja, how do we discuss Bildung as a concept in relation to your presentation, especially in relation to a current capitalist paradigm of a student as a client, reference to Gerd Bista, 2013. Mateja, would you answer briefly to this question?
Yes, I try. First, I have to say that Bildung is no more the central pedagogical concept, because actually we don't understand anymore the idea of enlightenment, that knowledge is knowledge educate. We today think that the way how we think, that emphasis of mode of working over the content. But Bildung measures basically both outcome, culture, and the process of shaping it. And this is the idea, this knowledge as knowledge educates. And if we look at our practices, we have curriculum that a teacher can choose how he will teach some content. And we can develop critical thinking today by Socrates, if we go to Plato, or with yellow stamp. The choice is on teacher. But then this choice is important in what it will be invested the subject. And we have people that don't know a lot of their history about everything. And this idea, this knowledge as knowledge educate, is today far away from practice. But I think that it will be in few years others, because we need such idea, because knowledge is undermined through practice, and it's very interesting to go in it. And that I think we will return to this concept.
Okay, thank you,
yeah.
Mateja. There is another question in the chat from Martise Spiteri. Martise, are you here?
Yes.
Yes, please, you can address your question directly to Anders.
Okay, so in Maltese classrooms during the pandemic, during online teaching, teachers use various apps. So how can the social learning dimension be adopted online?
Yes. Yeah. I think that that we often confuse this. We call this a social dimension with the physical dimension. There are a very developed social models for interaction online that's very useful. A problem is that not all students use them, or many students want to be spectators, both in the classroom and online, really. And if they are online, they become totally invisible if they don't interact and so on. I'm thinking also of the social dimension in the future, with more adaptive learning and learning in your own pace, etc., which makes time a lot spent different if everyone learns in own pace, and what happens then to the social dimension. I think we can use AI for that as well, if we can identify who has problems within the same area, but for example problems with different things in this area. That's a perfect working group, really, and I think that will beat this formal divisions of learning groups that we have in education today, etc. But you're right that it is with both with online and distance learning and with adaptive learning, it easily walks away in an individualized direction, but that is not necessary, I think.
Thank you, Anders. Are you happy with the response, Martise?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So is there any question in the room? Just please raise your hand if you have one. If not, I have one, which I would first of all address to Maria, but it can be addressed to Anders and Mateja as well in certain way. In the recent period, education in general is under the pressure of the norm to be useful. Education should be useful. Education is more and more understood as training and not as education in the traditional sense. And this, of course, applies also to teacher education in the present reforms, in the present education policy. And the COVID crisis brought something new. So if the school, if the learning institution is about to train a person, a future worker, say teacher or whatever, Then practical work is extremely important. Practicum, if we address this issue to teacher education. However, due to COVID measures, practical work was postponed more or less 100%. And this is different from general courses, if you wish, where we can teach over the Zoom lessons. So here I see the problem. Just reading the last reports from our education system, we see a notable change in admission of youngsters to upper secondary school this year. Namely, a significantly higher percentage of students age 15 would like to enroll general upper secondary education. And one of possible interpretation is that during the COVID crisis, it was easier for those students who decided for gymnasium, for grammar school, than for those who decided for technical schools or vocational schools and so on. I mean, this is a general problem. In particular, I would like to know what do you think, how teacher education is positioned in this situation? This is my question directly to Maria, but if there will be time, it would be good also to hear from Anders and Mateja about this issue.
Certainly COVID-19 has been a challenge to education, of course, and to teacher education in particular, because if we look at what we know in terms of the education of teachers, it is possible to identify, for instance, experiences of virtualization of practicum. So the practicum became virtual, online. So how did the practice or the teaching practice, which is an important component of teacher education, how was it developed within such challenging and unexpected circumstances? So there was I would say a danger. I mean, at least there was a challenge in terms of the orientation of the practicum. Maybe the idea of a more instrumental and a narrow view of training, as you said, training of a teacher as a technician, because it was more focused on how to apply given norms and regulations and ideas or prescriptions, rather than this transformative view that is underpinning the model that we know in my institution and in Portugal in general. So I would say there is a risk between an orientation related to training and to what works, rather than what would be best for each for a given specific situation. According to the information that we know, information available, if student teachers had spent less time in schools and in classrooms and interacting with the cooperating teachers, interacting with students, they had more time for reflection and more time for writing. But this does not mean that practice is not important. It is important, but it was possible to see these two kind of possibilities. One, in a way, a drawback, or the idea of teachers as a technician, implementing what works. So this within this more instrumental or narrow view of teaching, whereas it was also possible to identify practices or experiences oriented towards a more transformative view of education and of teacher education. I think this is what I would like to share in relation to your question. I don't know if I answered the question or if there is something that you want me to say more about what you have asked.
Well, actually, I was quite happy, Maria, with your response, and I agree quite a lot with what you said. Similar thoughts actually have been exchanged also here at my home with my colleagues. But perhaps we could also listen to some brief comments from the other two speakers, from Mateja and Anders on this issue. Mateja says, "Okay, Anders, would you?" We have just a few minutes.
Yeah. Just a short comment. I think we will see in a retro perspective that we have learned a lot during this COVID-19 period, and we will be able to make better decisions about the learning environment and which component of the course that has to be in a special form, etc. And a problem has been that workplaces and so on, where practicum things can be trained. They haven't been open so much for students during this period either. Otherwise, it's an ideal situation to have a work integrated teaching and learning as well.
Thank you, Anders. Do we have any other question? We only have 2 minutes left. If not, then I would like to thank once again to all three speakers for very interesting input. Again, you can send your slides or text to the conference email, and it will be posted on the website. Thank you, all participants. It was quite a wide forum. Now we have 15 minutes break. Unfortunately, we cannot meet for a coffee, but nevertheless, we will meet again in the next session in 15 minutes. Once again, thank you very much for this excellent beginning of the second day of the conference, and let's continue that way with the second session in 15 minutes.